Oh, hello. Welcome back to the Project Opel Manta suspension upgrade. I'm sitting up here on 4 jack stands trying to remember what it was like to drive this car because it's been a while. It's taken a bit to gather everything that I need. I've been working on refurbishing a lot of the components. If you've been following previous episodes, I show all that. I also sent all my hardware away to get replated. But now I'm finally at a point where I'm about ready to put the front end together, so very excited. There's still a few loose ends to take care of, so we'll start with that. I've got to modify some of the bushings, I've got to install the lower ball joints, got to deal with the sway bar, and miscellaneous, but we'll get into it. And by the end of this, my aim is to have the whole front end done. So let's go. Okay, the first pieces that I was able to clean up enough to actually paint were these support brackets that tie into the front crossmember and sway bar and steering rack. So these are going to have an interesting conundrum. The bushings go here, and here's one of the original ones, and there's no replacement for these. So what you have to do is use something aftermarket. What people do is use these GM leaf spring bushings. As you can see, it's actually the right size. Everything is a nice fit, except the length. They are too long. So in order to figure out how much I need to trim these down, first thing to do is to actually measure. Looks like it's right about 40 millimeters. So basically that means each one of these needs to be 20 millimeters. In these situations, it's always a good idea to cut off too little rather than too much. You can always trim these down more later as you're test fitting, but if you cut too much off, you're going to be left with a gap, and that's not good. Aha! There we are. Now hopefully just a really light hit on this upside down belt sander just to even it out a little bit. Okay, here we are with 2 of these bushings trimmed down, fitting nicely with no gap. And of course, still have to trim down this sleeve. So that's the next step. I'll make sure it's in the right spot over here, and then mark it on this side with a scratch awl, and then I'll use my little pipe cutter to cut it off. I started off by using this pipe cutter, but it was taking too long, so I finished it off with the good old hacksaw. Here's a look at the finished pair of these bushings ready to go in. Alright, these support brackets are going to be the first things to go back on the car, which is great. These are these bushings that I trimmed, and I just dipped them in some paint so there wasn't bare steel on the end. But before I install these, it's going to be really important to grease the polyurethane bushings. This is a specific grease that comes with them. I think it's a Teflon type of grease that's really sticky and yeah, lasts a long time and keeps these things quiet and lubricated. So I'll pop these out, cover every surface with grease as well as the sleeve, make sure they're all nice and lubricated, and we can install these. I also just finished cleaning up the steering rack because I want to put it on at the same time. So I got new rubber dust boots because the old ones were split open, and you can see that some of these clamps and things are replated. Those were part of the batch. Looks really nice to have those fresh. And I even painted the tie rods because why not? I want everything to look nice. I'm really hung up on aesthetics. Installing the steering rack is a little bit tricky. You have to get it up in this little space and then have enough wiggle room where you can reinstall the coupler onto the steering shaft from the column. Eventually I got it in place and was able to start the bolts. I wanted to get all of these front bolts lined up and through the holes before I tightened anything down, just to make sure they were all going to line up. And then I could tighten these steering rack bolts. These have these special little locking tabs, so make sure to lock them down and get them in the right position. Then I could tighten these back bolts, and after you torque them to spec, make sure you line up the hole for your cotter pins. Next, it was time to install the lower ball joints. They just press into place, so I was able to use my ball joint kit once again, which has come in very handy in this project. The only problem I ran into was that the lower adapter was a bit too wide to fit into the lower control arm. So I had to end up getting a bit creative with the adapters, but I eventually found a way to find the clearance I needed and press these into place. Finally, I realized that the last thing keeping me from bolting everything on the car was the spindles that kind of hold everything together. So I went ahead and cleaned them up, primed them, and painted them a nice silver color. Exciting times in the driveway. I think I've finally refurbished enough components and sourced all the parts that I can start putting the front suspension back together. Look at all this beautiful shiny stuff. This is the part that I enjoy. It's like I said in an earlier video, it's like a big Lego set to put back together. So I still have some work to do on the brakes, but at least the spindles are refurbished and they hold everything together, so I can put the rest back on later. Here's some of the restored hardware. There's going to be more, but these are some of the inner bushing sleeves that I'm going to have to put into these new polyurethane bushings. And these go a certain way. I think the flange has to go to the front side of the car, but I'll double check that. There's directions with it. It's the same on the uppers. Here's my Coney shocks and lowering springs from KAW in Germany. And these are new rubber hats. Couldn't find a good correct polyurethane upper, but I think rubber will be good on the front. Don't want it to be too harsh, but I'll probably put a little bit of silicone lubricant on these so they don't squeak. But all the new ball joints are in. Of course, nice new hardware. Got the lowers in, as you saw. And I'm not going to put the sway bar bushings in. I'm going to install those onto the ends of the sway bar first and then put that in. But I'm not done with that yet either. But like I said, there's enough stuff here that I can put all these things on. So I think what I'll do is I'll struggle with one side, figure it out, probably do a time lapse, and then I'll do a deeper how-to on the other side. But first thing is to install the new bushings in the control arms. So let's do that. Greasing the bushings is pretty straightforward. It's the same stuff that we used on those other ones, that crazy Teflon grease. So just coat every surface inside and out of the bushings, press them in. If you can't get them in by hand, you can use a vise to get them the rest of the way. And same deal with the inner sleeves, give them some grease, press them into place. I ended up using my vise along with one of those ball joint spacers to press the bushings in the upper control arms because they were pretty tight. And then I also used the vise to even up the inner sleeve. As promised, here's a quick little time lapse of me putting the passenger side together. Everything went pretty smoothly, so we'll do a little more detailed look when I put the driver's side together. The lower control arm was the first thing to go in. Had a little trouble getting this bolt through with the steering rack in the way, but it's doable. A little help from a hammer handle. I'm not torquing anything yet, I'm just getting it snug, and once everything is in place, we'll torque with a bit of load on everything. These upper control arm bolts and spacers, They were on in a certain order, so I'm just putting them on the same way they were before, but these spacers can be changed to influence the alignment. And this is where I'm using these new nylock nuts to replace the old all-metal lock nuts. Again, not torquing this, just getting it snug. And then I bungee corded it up out of the way. Here's one of the new spring hats, whatever the correct term is. I'm deciding to lubricate it a little bit with some silicone grease, which should be compatible with the rubber and not damage it. I think this is optional for rubber bushings, but it seems to me could be a good idea to prevent squeaks. Then I could simply place the spring in place since the lower control arm is drooped all the way down, and then use the jack with a block of wood to start to compress it. It's always a little bit scary. But then I could go ahead and put the spindle on, and once both the nuts are tightened enough, that'll hold the upper and lower control arms together and prevent the spring from going anywhere so it won't fly out and chop my head off. Now it's time to start torquing things. Make sure you look up all the torque specifications if you have a shop manual. In my case, some of these parts actually came with printed instructions, which is nice. I have both resources. And it's a good idea to torque things with a little bit of a load on the suspension, so that's why I have it jacked up a bit to sort of simulate the normal ride height with some weight on it. Then I could install the shock, fairly straightforward. The upper attachment is a little hard to get to on this car. On this lower mount, once again, I'm using an original bolt but a new nylock nut. And of course these have a torque specification as well, so it's important to pay attention to all those specs and set everything accordingly. With everything torqued, I could then take the tension off and we're pretty much done. Look at how good this stuff looks. This is a very gratifying moment in the project. Still a lot to do, but getting this out of the way and getting all these major components on feels like a real turning point. Okay, so for this next phase, I'm going to need some cotter pins to lock down those castle nuts. Before I go to the store, I think I saw some in this basement down here. Let's take a look. These were probably put here about 50 years ago by my grandpa, who I never met. So it's really cool to think that he left these behind just for me. When you're going to install cotter pins, just remember that the longer side goes up, and that's the one that you're going to bend up and over the bolt. The other side you can either trim, or I like to bend it down so it's at least doing something, but that top one's doing most of the work. These are a very important little detail as they prevent those nuts from backing off, and having something in your front suspension fall apart while you're driving could be deadly, so don't forget these little cotter pins. The next phase was going to be installing the brakes. My original rotors were still in good shape, but were just looking kind of ugly, so I de-rusted them, masked off the disc surface, and gave them some brake caliper paint so it's high temperature and it should stand up. Next, I could go ahead and install my disc brake dust shields. These are some of the things that I sent to get zinc plated, and yeah, I could have just painted them, but man, it's so shiny. It looks amazing. And then I could put these back steering knuckles on. They kind of attach through the dust shield, and these are the pieces that the tie rod's attached to. Just like everything else in the front end, these have a torque specification, so don't forget that. My original plan was to refurbish my old brake calipers. They definitely need new seals. There are rebuild kits available, but once I got to looking how crusty they were, I sprung for this new set from Opel GT Source. They actually come yellow zinc plated, which I didn't even know before. So it's amazing that they're going to match everything else, and they're not going to just rust like generic parts store bare metal calipers. They come loaded with new pads and all the nice hardware, so I think it was a worthwhile upgrade. Then I could unmask the rotors, and it was time to re-grease the bearings, install the seal at the back. This definitely isn't one of my favorite parts of the process, just getting loads of grease all over my hands. It's kind of a dirty portion of the project. Make sure to grease the spindle. Everything needs generous amounts of grease. And then I could slide this on, line up the special washer, wipe off a little bit of that excess, and then I could get the special castle nut started. The rule of thumb here, as I understand it, is to snug down this nut to where those bearings are going to be fully seated. You'll be able to feel that the rotor doesn't really want to turn. And then back it off by about a quarter turn. What you're looking for is zero play when you grab the rotor and try to move it in and out, but the wheel should spin freely. Once you're happy with that, you can go ahead and install the cotter pin. In my case, it was a little too long, so I trimmed the ends off. And then finally, a nice new grease cap goes over to cover it all. I ended up kind of bashing this one in too much because I didn't realize the lip doesn't go all the way flush with the rotor. And then I could finally install these beautiful new calipers. And once again, you guessed it, these bolts have a torque spec. Things are really starting to look good. I'm excited at this stage. Well, now we need to deal with the front sway bar. I've kind of been putting this off because these end bushings are so difficult. As you can see, I tried bashing it off and that didn't work. So finally I had to resort to sawing it in half. I swear this hacksaw has been one of the most useful tools for this whole project. I had to be careful not to go too far because I don't want to saw into the sway bar, but I needed to cut it enough that I could split it open. Eventually I was able to use a chisel to get it fully split, and it came off at last. Okay, I'm all done cleaning up the front sway bar. It's all nice and repainted. And I've laid out all the new bushings to show how they're gonna go on. As you can see, I left the ends bare metal because they have those splines on them and they press into the bushings. So I figured if I painted them, the paint would just scrape off as soon as I put those on. So I think I'm gonna put some fluid film on there to try to prevent rust and prolong the life of it. These bushings are specific in which way they go, so I'll have to be mindful of that and put them on first before I put the end bushings on. The bar itself goes a certain way. It has this dip in the middle to sort of provide more clearance for the transmission. So the way I have it laid out here is basically how it goes on the car. So first of all, I'm gonna have to slide those bushings on, and it's gonna be tight. So I'll probably use some silicone grease or something to help slide them on. As you can see, this is where these go on the car. And it fits this way, but not so much if you get it wrong. So, let's be sure not to get it wrong. I'm back to this same silicone grease again to not damage the rubber, but give it some lubrication as it goes onto the bar. Really tight fit, difficult to get this started. And then once it was started, I could barely move it. So I decided to clamp it in my vise, and then I could shove the sway bar through it, and that ended up working out pretty well. Okay, now that I got those inner ones on, I can put these big outer bushings on. But before I do that, I want to protect this bare steel so it doesn't get rusty right away. So I'm gonna try putting some fluid film on there. It's supposed to be good for this kind of thing. And it might be easier to put some on a rag, a paper towel, and then put that on so I'm not spraying it all over the place. So this inner side is oblong, but the side that goes through the lower control arm is circular, so it doesn't matter too much which way this goes on. But I remember originally they were horizontal like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slip both sides on, lay it flat on the ground so they're both horizontal, and then get them started. Hello, it's me from the future. I just had to cut in here because I made a mistake. I did this whole thing wrong on the sway bar. Did it completely in the wrong order, and caused some issues for me. So I'm just going to jump in here and nip this in the bud and tell you the right way to do it. So you're supposed to put these big front bushings in the lower control arms first, and then feed the sway bar into those and use the bolts to feed it all the way in and tighten it down. What I ended up doing was I put the bushings onto the sway bar first, and kind of similarly used the bolts to tighten them all the way in. And then I figured I could put the whole sway bar in place and somehow get those through the lower control arms. I underestimated how difficult this would be. I eventually devised a little tool to press the bushing through on one side, and that worked okay. But then when I went to do the second side, it didn't line up right, so I was fighting it and struggling, and I ended up kind of forcing it and broke one of these rare and valuable bushings. You can see I split that wide open, and so I don't really have faith in this one anymore. It's a pretty important piece. So that's 60 bucks down the tubes. I was just very lucky that there was one left available in the country at the one main Opel parts place here. So was able to get another one, but it was the last one, and I'm just glad these things are available. So as of right now, I actually have one side installed. For the second side, I'm going to go ahead and do it the correct way and install the new bushing into the control arm and then the sway bar into it. So hopefully it'll all work out. Plan of attack. This is the new bushing. I got a long bolt. This is actually a 1/2 inch bolt by 6 inches. And then this is one of the sleeves from my ball joint kit. It's just the right size to fit. And as I tighten this nut, it's gonna, in theory, pull this through into place. And I need to trim my fingernails. But other than that, should work out okay. Let's go. Pleased to report that this time around it worked out. Nothing was broken, much success was had. So when I went to get the sway bar through the bushing, I could only barely get it lined up, and the original bolt was not nearly long enough, so it's a good thing I had this alternate M14 bolt that was longer that I could thread into it and use that to start pulling it through. Once it was pulled through enough, I could put the actual bolt in and torque it down to 87 foot-pounds. With that fiasco out of the way, I could finally jack up the rear of the bar to line it up with the holes. I still had to tweak these bushings side to side a little bit to get them to line up. Once they were lined up, I could get the bolts started and torque them down to spec as well. As a finishing touch, I could reinstall this heat shield that I had replated. This protects the bushings from the exhaust pipe, which ends up right next to this. Okay, one of the final things I have to do on the front end is bend a couple of new brake lines for the front calipers. As you can see, I had to cut this one to liberate it from the old caliper. The fitting was really boogered, and at the time I didn't have proper line wrenches. Since then I've remedied the situation and gotten a set of these Husky line wrenches from Home Depot. Great to have anytime you're messing with lines. Anyway, the other tool that I got is this little tube bender from Harbor Freight. You can buy at most auto parts stores these straight pre-assembled brake tubes. So just get them with the right size fittings and the right thread and the right length. Although these are actually a little bit too long. I couldn't find the exact right length, but it's pretty close. And as you can see, I've been able to pretty much match the shape somewhat close. I had to put some extra whoop-de-doo in it to try to make up for the extra length. But it's just going to be some trial and error, going back and forth and test fitting this on the car. You just sandwich it in there. And I'm actually going to try to do a more gradual bend. So I'm going to do a little bit there, scoot it. And you're just using your hands to help it along. A little bit at a time, and there we go. There's a nice gradual 90-degree bend. You can never really go backwards, so it's better to bend it too little rather than too much. So once I get these all done and plumbed in, that's pretty much all that's left. Finally, using my new line wrench, I could install these lines permanently. I'll still have to wait to bleed the brakes until the rear is together, but other than that, the front brakes are essentially done. Well, hello there. I have horrible news. I was just about ready to wrap this whole thing up and pat myself on the back for how nice it turned out when I came to a horrible realization. I put the wrong springs in. These are the rear springs. Oh. How did I not notice this? Well, the springs are very similar. They're the same, almost the same diameter. And what I was going off of is which ones fit better into the hats or the rubber bushings that fit into the springs. And yeah, they seem to fit perfectly. But what I missed and didn't understand at the time was these two little letters printed on each of the springs, which are German abbreviations for which side they go on. So kind of easy to overlook, but I should have paid closer attention. So these ones that I put on have a HA, which actually means Hinterachse, if I'm saying that correctly, which means rear axle. The other springs have a VA printed on them, which means Vorderachse, front axle. So you can see where I may have missed that, but I'm still very frustrated. I get to take things apart again, switch the springs out, and then I can be just about done. But man, I feel stupid. I hate this kind of mistake. Just hoping to be able to get back on track and correct this problem. So. This was about the last thing I wanted to be doing, but here goes. I detached the sway bar from the back to hopefully give the lower control arm some room to swing. Then I could remove the shock. Then I could remove the upper ball joints and swing the upper control arm out of the way. I didn't have enough room still with the lower control arm, so I had to use a spring compressor to get the spring all the way out, and then transfer it over to the correct spring, compress it, get it in place, reattach the upper ball joint, reinstall the shock, retorque everything that was detached, and then move on to the other side and do the same thing. I totally forgot about this little detail. This is one of the HA marked springs, meaning rear axle. This one is also marked with the word front. Why in the world would you put the word front on a rear spring? I'm pretty sure this was the final thing that made me decide these must be the front springs, because it says front. I don't get it, but at least this is behind me now and I'm back on track. Finally, with all that nonsense behind me, I could bolt the wheels on for the first time. I'm doing this so I can set the alignment by eyeball. It's obviously easier to do with the wheels on. And basically, I'm just turning the tie rods in and out until the wheels look like they're pretty straight, maybe pointed inward a little bit. The car's going to track better that way as opposed to if they were pointed out a little. And of course, make sure the steering wheel is centered and the steering rack is in the middle before doing this. But once I was happy with that, I could lock down the nut on the tie rods and torque the castle nut on the end, put a cotter pin through, and it should be good enough to get me to the alignment shop to get a proper alignment when that time comes. Once that was done, I decided to move in some ramps and actually set the car down on its own weight for the first time in months. Once it was sitting on its own weight, I gave it a little bounce just to settle the suspension and see what it felt like, and I think it's going to be good. Well, this has been quite a process. Not entirely smooth, I've had some hiccups along the way, but I have to say I'm really happy with how this front end turned out. It looks beautiful. My initial feeling, just kind of bouncing it up and down, it feels really good, so I think it's going to drive great when it's all finished. And if you forget what it used to look like, or you missed earlier episodes, check out these before and after shots. So next time I'll be putting the rear together. I have to rebuild the torque tube and basically install all those rear bushings, clean up the axle, put the springs and shocks in and all that good stuff. But hopefully the next time you see me, I'll be able to put this thing on the ground finally and actually drive it. It's been months since I've driven it and I miss it. So I'm ready. So hopefully I'll get back on it, get the rear end done, and I will see you in the next video. Good day.